David detested himself for being always impoverished. He married an elderly woman for her money because he wanted to be wealthy without having to work for it. When she stated this, he was astounded by what he saw. Welcome to USA Stories channel. Do not forget to subscribe and activate the bell button to receive all new updates. Now let's go to the story. David was born into poverty and disliked his life from an early age. His parents put in a lot of overtime to support the family, but their combined pay was insufficient to cover their essential expenses. David was extremely irritated by his family's ongoing financial hardships. Despite their best efforts, it appeared as though nothing ever worked out for them. David was attractive, even if he had little money. Oh my, very, very beautiful. It was as though the world's most attractive individuals got together and resolved to create someone even more gorgeous than themselves. This was a truth about himself that he was constantly arrogant about. David discovered early on that he could have some advantages that he would not have otherwise been able to enjoy because of his appearance. He befriended several people who enjoyed giving him presents. He was able to win over almost anyone's heart as he grew older. Several girls would frequently approach him, but he never invited them to his home. He knew that if they found out he was from a low-income family, they would no longer respect him. He was so anxious to get out of his parents' dilapidated and unsightly home. Thus, he moved out of his parents' home as soon as he reached 18 and into the home of a friend. He was able to make a few bucks a month working at a pub. David enjoyed being away from home for a little while. He relished the accompanying freedom. He quickly discovered, though, that being alone didn't always translate into happiness. Life remained difficult and demanding. David went to his own apartment, a loft on the opposite side of town, and lived there after working for a few months. He was able to secure employment in a table water plant there. Compared to the previous one, it offered somewhat better working conditions and a little higher compensation. But soon after starting this employment, he came to the conclusion that earning a wage was not what he was meant to do. Since his pay didn't cover him for more than a week, he was forced to borrow money to get by for the remainder of the month. But the explanation is not implausible. David led a lavish lifestyle. He would frequently attend pricey events and frivolously spend money on jewelry and technology. He appeared to be making an effort to show everyone that he was not as impoverished as his parents. Sadly, this way of living left him destitute and penniless. His mental state quickly began to suffer as a result of his financial situation. He began arriving late for work and was unable to complete duties that were given to him. His sole source of income was terminated when the firm eventually had enough of his appalling attitude toward work. He was ejected from his flat since he was unable to pay his rent due to his lack of income. Upon asking his pals whether he might remain with them, he was met with rejection. If they let him stay, his pals worried that his bad lifestyle and sloth would spread. David was forced to go back to his parents' house at this moment. He had not realized how bad it would be. His only thought since the day he moved back in was how he was going to get out. He would stop at nothing to return to his opulent lifestyle, which he so much wanted. At that moment, he recalled Agatha, the wealthy acquaintance of one of his buddies. She was a widow, having inherited his whole fortune after her husband passed away following a brief illness. The woman had assets all throughout the nation that continuously brought in money for her, and she was worth millions of dollars. At 80 years old, Agatha was a grandmother to 3 children and 6 grandchildren. David thought that she would be his key to regaining access to the major leagues, as she was lonely without her spouse. The strategy was straightforward. He would win her affection and marry her in order to obtain her estate once she passed away. What a brilliant move! David got to work planning right away. He observed her movements and was familiar with her usual haunts. He planned to run into her by mistake one day. David had a natural ability to win women over, and he gave Agatha his all. Agatha was no different from everyone other he had seen to fall prey to his charms and stunning looks. She found it hard to accept that a young, attractive man would show love interest in her. What could this man possibly see in her when she thought she was old and wrinkled? She quickly gave up on this, though, and began to thank her stars that she had met such a gentleman in David. He knew how much she liked them, so he took her on romantic outings, bought her flowers, and made sure she always had chocolate. With all the attention, Agatha felt delirious. David asked her to marry him 2 months after their first encounter, and she accepted. David then expressed his love for her. David was ecstatic. At last, all of his hard work was paying off, and he would soon be enjoying the fruits of his labor. They were joined in marriage in a modest ceremony that took place in an outlying church. Not even Agatha's kids were present for the wedding. They opposed getting married. The priest and the marriage witness were the only individuals in attendance. Agatha was clearly disturbed by this, so David reassured her that pure love required no audience, and she accepted his words. David moved into Agatha's mansion that day, and the two of them started living together as husband and wife. David also started getting ready to persuade her to amend the will to his advantage. Even the ones that would have gone to her kids, he wanted them all. They were all prosperous and doing well after all. He would pilfer every last coin, leaving them with nothing at all. David attempted to bring up the will as the months passed, but she would invariably divert the conversation. He had to play this game clever since he couldn't be honest with her, because she would assume that he was really her money all along. He was a good husband, taking good care of his wife at this period. Given her advanced age, he drove her anywhere she desired to go, brought her to the hospital for regular exams, and even picked up cooking so he could make her some fresh meals. With the touch of a finger, he could give her with anything at all. He resembled an exalted babysitter, with the exception that he was wed to her. When she became ill a year after they were married, things really started to get serious. He was still not successful at this point in convincing her to leave him anything that she possessed. In any case, he accepted that he would receive nothing from her since he was positive that the sickness would claim her life. Rather, he would settle for the inheritance he would receive as her spouse. Even though it accounted for over half of her total wealth, that was still a substantial amount of money. He went to see her one day at the hospital, but a security officer stopped him just as he was going to enter her private ward. He responded in a kind tone, "I'm afraid you can't go in there, sir." David became agitated. "Are you crazy? By what do you mean? I must see my spouse." The guard gave him a sly smile. "Sir, this patient is not married. After her husband passed away, her kids said they didn't want others to see their mother." "What are you talking about?" stated David. Before he could continue, 3 security guards came up and escorted him outside. David was stunned and perplexed. What was taking place? What had gone wrong for him? When he visited the hospital early the next day, he was dismissed once more. On the 3rd day, he went and was at last granted permission to meet Agatha. "Hi, Agatha. You were sorely missed. The insane dudes refused to allow me in." He held her hands for a brief while and remarked, "It's so hard without you." Agatha said nothing. She then let out a loud, prolonged laugh that lasted for almost 3 minutes. David instantly got out of bed because he was so terrified. What makes this so humorous? His heart was pounding as he said, "Why are you laughing?" Agatha called him a huge idiot just now. She went on to tell him that she had known all along that he was just with her for her money. She needed the diversion and had played along since she was lonely. She also made the decision to step it up a level after realizing how helpful he was around the house. She also disclosed that their union was a fraud. She had even paid for a witness, and she had cast a homeless guy in the role of a priest. David was astounded by what he heard. Though he wanted to cry, the tears refused to flow. It had all been for nothing. All the work he had put into making this work. He had been duped. He was utilized by Agatha. Well, he was going to utilize her first anyhow. David was beyond repair. Without further remark, he left the hospital and went back to his parents' house. He realized that such a fast-paced life would only do harm to oneself. He had to follow the correct path if he wished to become wealthy. He was therefore going to begin improving himself. Then perhaps he would prevail in this fight with poverty, or perhaps not. How would you rate Agatha's handling of the situation? Man mocks his father while in flight, without knowing who he is. Respect came easily to Alan Thompson, even if he didn't always ask for it. He was an executive who had served as a military officer and was enough to make people sit up straight. All he was attempting to do today was go back to Boston following an exhausting week spent in Chicago attending business meetings. Jake, his 8-year-old son, was going with him and was looking forward to their weekend activities. Alan located their seats in a row in the middle of the aircraft as he and Jake made their way down the aisle. Jake sat at the window and observed the ground crew by putting his nose against the glass. In the hopes that they might be lucky and have a little more room, Alan took a seat in the center, leaving the aisle seat unoccupied. A man in his mid-40s came over a few minutes later, puffing slightly as he got to the overhead bin. With a loud thump, he settled his suitcase into the seat and shifted uncomfortable right away. Alan gave him a quick glance and a courteous nod, but all he got was a chilly look. With a heavy sigh, the guy straightened and said to himself, although Alan chose to ignore him and concentrate on assisting Jake with his seatbelt, it was evident that the man was uncomfortable. He moved to the very edge of his seat and leaned almost on the armrest, as though he wanted to put more space between him and Alan. "Is something wrong?" Alan questioned in a cool, collected tone. With a frustrated expression, the man turned to face him. "Yes, there is a problem. Is it not apparent to you? You take up too much room and smell like cheap cologne." Alan was surprised at how direct it was. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," spat out the guy. "You and your child are a bother. It's unbelievable that I have to spend the entire flight sitting next to you." The violent remarks hurled at his father caused Jake's eyes to widen. Alan had a wave of protection, but remained calm. "If we're giving you any distress, I apologize. We'll do our best to avoid becoming too noticeable." "That's not the point," the man shot back. "You guys shouldn't be permitted to fly. You consider yourself to be so significant, but in reality, you just burden other people." Alan sensed the growing anxiety, his son's eyes remaining wide and perplexed. The other passengers began to notice the discussion as the plane filled up. Sensing that things may get out of hand, one of them, a young lady called Lisa who was seated in a row behind, pulled out her phone and started to record. Alan inhaled deeply. "Look, our only goal is to reach our home. This type of action is not necessary." The guy leaned forward, contorting his disdainful expression. "Do you really believe that wearing a suit and owning an ostentatious watch makes you superior to everyone else? You're not, though. With a child who most likely doesn't even know who his true father is, you're simply an adulterous brat." Alan felt the remark like a kick to the stomach, but before he could say anything, a hard hand closed over his shoulder. He looked over and saw a big man with a serious expression looming over him. "Sir," the guy remarked, looking directly at the displeased traveler, "I must beg that you please stop being so agitated. Your actions are not appropriate." Startled, the man looked up. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm a police officer," the man said, revealing his badge, "and I don't put up with harassment. I've been recording everything I've heard of your abuse." The impolite passenger's face lost all of its color. He turned to look around and saw that a number of other passengers were now observing and documenting the altercation. His bravado soon subsided, giving way to a twitch of nervousness. Alan saw the man's response and experienced a mixture of relief and validation. The power dynamic had radically changed as a result of the police officer's involvement. Jake pulled at his dad's cuff. "Dad, what's happening?" Alan gave his kid a comforting grip on the hand. "Jake, don't worry. The individual is now receiving attention after simply acting rudely." The policeman looked back at Alan. "Are you okay, sir?" Alan gave a nod. "Yes, I appreciate that. Thank you for your assistance." The officer took another look at the impolite passenger. "I propose that you express regret to this man and his child. If not, we may need to involve the airline personnel, and you may be asked to leave this aircraft." The man's arrogance had completely vanished. He gave a halting, half-hearted apology without looking directly at Alan. After glaring at him, the officer nodded to Alan and walked back a few seats to his seat. The flight attendants were getting ready to take off as the plane was now completely boarding. Alan turned to face his kid, who was still in shock from the incident. He said, "It's all over now, buddy. Let's just enjoy the flight." Jake gave a nod, but his face didn't change. "Why was that man so mean, Dad?" Alan sighed, trying to think of anything to say. People sometimes take out their frustrations on others because they are very angry within. However, we refuse to let it alter who we are. We continue to be nice and strong. Jake gave this some thought and then grinned a bit. "You're strong, Dad." Alan tossed his son's hair about. "I'm grateful, Jake. And you too." The stress slowly released as the jet taxied and lifted off. Alan reclined on his chair, attempting to unwind. Lisa was still clutching her phone behind him, he observed. She met his gaze and nodded encouragingly. The airliner started its descent into Boston a couple hours later. As they prepared to get off, the atmosphere had relaxed and people were having quiet conversations. Lisa got up and came over to talk to Alan as they taxied to the gate. "Hello, I just wanted to say how sad I am that you had to experience that. I'm going to post the entire thing online that I taped. People must realize that such behavior is unacceptable." Alan gave a grateful smile. "I'm grateful, Lisa. That has great significance. I hope it will have an impact." She gave a nod. "I believe it will. You carried it off with such elegance. It's a blessing your son has you." "I'm grateful," Alan said, his pride shining brightly. "I just hope he learned something positive from all this." Alan thought back on the day's events as they got off the plane and moved through the terminal. He felt thankful, yet tired at the same time. The off-duty officer's involvement and the passengers' support had transformed what could have been a traumatic event into a teaching moment about compassion and resiliency. Once they got home, Alan put Jake to bed, who was already tired from the long day. In a whisper, "Good night, buddy." He brushed a stray hair off of Jake's forehead. "Good night, Dad," a half-drowsy Jake said. With a gentle shut, Alan went to his own room. Sitting on the edge of his bed, he considered how rapidly circumstances might change and how crucial it was to always do the right thing, even when it was tough. After Lisa's video went viral a few days later, there was a lot of indignation and support for Alan and Jake. Individuals from various walks of life related their personal experiences with rudeness and bigotry, and many complimented Alan on his cool-headed reply. In order to better manage such circumstances in the future, Oceanic Airways announced additional training programs for its employees and made a public apology. In addition, they gave Alan and Jake free tickets for their subsequent journey, which Alan politely accepted. That flight turned out to be more than simply a personal struggle for Alan. It acted as a spark for change, igniting conversations about civility and empathy in public settings. It served as a reminder to everybody that confronting rudeness and discrimination, no matter how little the act may appear, can have a noteworthy impact. With their relationship becoming even closer, Alan and Jake carried on with their lives as the days stretched into weeks. They were aware that they had overcome a difficult situation and emerged stronger than before. The influence of Alan's calm power and Jake's naive resilience had extended well beyond the flight. They both learned a vital lesson from the incident. Respect and decency are essential, and it is our collective duty to uphold them. It also served as a reminder of the strength of community and the ability of strangers to band together in unexpected ways to support and defend one another. And so Alan and Jake continued their trip, their tale acting as a ray of hope and a constant reminder of the value of standing up for what is right, wherever it may lead. Alan Thompson's interaction on the airplane teaches us the value of speaking out against discrimination and bullying. Along with the assistance of other passengers and the involvement of an off-duty police officer, Alan's cool-headed and collected response to the disrespectful passenger demonstrates the strength of the community in battling injustice. The narrative emphasizes that respect and dignity are essential human rights and that it is everyone's duty to uphold them in all circumstances. It also demonstrates how deeds of kindness and unity may turn traumatic circumstances into potent teaching moments for empathy and resilience. Alan's tale serves as a reminder to not let other people's negativity dictate how we behave. Instead, we may promote a more welcoming and courteous atmosphere by remaining composed and advocating for others as well as ourselves. Have you ever seen or been in an instance when someone was treated unfairly? What was the outcome of the encounter, and how did you react? Post your ideas and anecdotes in the comments section below. When the police discover who is on the other side of the tunnel they locate within the KFC, they give up. The sound of his steel-toed boots clattering on the tiles was the only sound resonating through the deserted restaurant as he tiptoed forward. He crept toward the rear of the kitchen, walking silently past the greasy, deep-fat fryer. He neared the corner, his muscles tensed, and halted abruptly upon noticing the 8-inch hole. He made a backup call. In his many years with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Officer John Irwin had seen a lot, but nothing like this. It all started when he was sent to lead a raid on an Arizona KFC building by HSI Special Agent Scott Brown. Following an anonymous tip, Brown came to the conclusion that the fast food restaurant giant was concealing more than just its 11 patented secret herbs and spices. It's common knowledge that KFC, a fried chicken business with 20,000 locations worldwide, including almost 4,500 in the U.S., behind McDonald's in terms of fast food sales. The Colonel's chicken business is expanding, but when Homeland Security officials happened upon one franchisee in San Luis, Arizona, they were astounded by what they saw. Residents of San Luis recall an era when the Mexican border was only 200 yards away, when they could get a bucket of fried chicken. Nevertheless, the once popular restaurant shell began to degrade when KFC abruptly closed its doors to the public one day. The paint started to bubble off the walls, and the sign faded in the scorching heat. Strangely enough, there were usually a few automobiles parked outside, yet no one knew why it remained empty for years. Lights started to turn on inside the KFC late at night, months after the restaurant had closed. The community started to make rumors that the building may reopen. They thought the restaurant was remodeling when they heard drilling and explosions. To the amazement of everybody, however, the building stayed closed. Then the gossip started. Some had heard through the grapevine that a wealthy local individual had purchased the KFC, while others had heard that it had been acquired by a massive corporation. However, none could have ever imagined what was actually happening inside those collapsing walls. In fact, it took months for the authorities to put the puzzle pieces together. Special Agent Scott Brown of HSI received a call on his personal mobile phone late one evening. Brown was annoyed by the late hour and thought about putting the call on voicemail, but then he had an odd feeling. He gave a rough response, never imagining that the man on the other end of the telephone would offer him such a clue. He needed an order quickly. A search warrant was requested by Immigration and Customs Enforcement to enter the now vacant KFC building. Officer John Irwin was assigned to lead the ICE team when it was approved, but he found an 8-inch hole in the wall when he went into the dirty kitchen. He made a backup call. They started to remove the plaster that covered the hole, exposing a deep tunnel. What were they able to discover? When Officer John Irwin peered into the dark hole with a flashlight, he was shocked to discover hundreds of wooden boards along the walls. With caution, the group entered and descended down a dimly lit corridor. The tunnel was big enough for a man to comfortably fit within, measuring 3 feet wide by 5 feet tall. Officer Irwin inhaled deeply before vanishing down the tube. The cops trailed behind, moving silently into the tunnel, and hoping that there were no armed guards waiting for them on the other end. But what would they discover, and how far down did the corridor go? The sound of footsteps racing in the other direction abruptly pierced the calm. They weren't alone themselves. At that point, they started to realize an astonishing truth. Officer Irwin instantly recognized it. The tunnel was designed to cross the border into Mexico directly. They reached a ladder at the end of the 600-yard tunnel, which led to a trapdoor in the ceiling. They waited for a bit, then Officer John Irwin motioned for silence. He kicked through the trapdoor after that. Officer Irwin broke through the trapdoor quickly and peeked out warily. He could see rusting bed springs above him. They would have to venture outside to look further, but when they did, they were astounded by what they saw. They had found themselves in a Mexican home, behind a bed. Officer Irwin didn't have time to check the long rope that was adjacent to the trapdoor opening when he discovered it. There was a visitor approaching. The cops noticed a dim flashlight beam and heard footsteps reverberating down the tunnel. The man almost walked into them as they stood back and waited. When he ascended the ladder and discovered that ICE agents encircled him, his eyes grew wide. In his palm was a luggage that was immediately seized. What was happening in this place? It was just by coincidence that the first puzzle piece had arrived. A guy had been stopped for a regular traffic stop by border police just weeks before the tunnel's location was discovered. The man's license and license plates appeared to be in order after the standard questioning. Just as the cops were going to release the man, their assistance dog took one look at his trailer and became quite aggressive. After searching the trailer, the cops discovered 2 toolboxes. However, they were shocked when they opened them. Upon careful examination, illicit substances were found in both boxes. Ivan Lopez, the guy, was quickly taken into custody, but investigating his background revealed a shameless scheme that no one had anticipated. Although Lopez's freedom had ended, his impact had only just begun. Scott Brown, a special agent with HSI, received a disturbing call following Lopez's detention. He got a call from an unidentified neighbor who made him believe they were only beginning to look into Lopez's criminal history. Following considerable investigation, Brown found that Lopez had paid $390,000 in cash for the old KFC. He called Immigration and Customs Enforcement right away, but did he move quickly enough? Officials soon realized that the purpose of this blatant underborder tunnel was to allow Lopez and his allies to carry drugs into the United States from Mexico. In fact, the drugs found in Lopez's apprehended toolboxes were estimated to be worth $1 million. However, what was the secret to their success? Due of the tunnel's length, officials surmised that the traffickers would descend via the Mexican home's trapdoor and proceed 600 yards until they were right beneath the former KFC structure. After leaving the illegal goods behind, they would be hauled out by a rope and an 8-inch hole in the restaurant's wall. However, Arizona is not the first state with tunnels of this type. Although tunnel construction takes time, there are undoubtedly more of them now that border security procedures have tightened. In a statement, HSI Special Agent Scott Brown said, "One of the things that tunneling does tell us is that as we increase infrastructure resources patrol, that's forcing them to go to more costly routes into the U.S., he stated. Lopez is said to be a well-known member of the Mexican cartel by the authorities. As he waits for criminal charges, he is now being held without bail in prison. Agent Scott Brown further notes that although cartel tunnels are spreading over the Mexican border, the KFC tunnel in Arizona possesses a particularly unsettling quality. Brown claims that the chemicals discovered by the investigators were all strong narcotics. He said, "I think that's what makes this tunnel a little more unique and frankly a little more scary than some of the other ones we've seen." The town's chief of police, Richard Jessup, told the Washington Post that the increase in tunnels is not unexpected. Generally along the southwest border, every couple of months we're encountering a tunnel, Jessup said. Of course, if you can't go over the wall, you go under it. Not all of these tunnels are left incomplete, though the majority are. By far the longest cartel tunnel was the KFC tunnel. Agents found a nearly half-mile tunnel that led to Tijuana, Mexico, in San Diego, California in 2016. Furthermore, it's not even the first to begin in San Luis. In fact, a 2012 case discovered a tunnel connecting Arizona City to San Luis Rio Colorado in Mexico. Even still, the tunnel that emerges from the shuttered fast food restaurant remains a remarkable addition to the extensive record of incidents along the border, primarily due to the massive amount of hard drugs that appear to be moved via it. A nice cruise vacation can be quite costly for some individuals, especially those who don't have much money to spare. Some individuals may put money down for years in the hopes of purchasing a ticket on one of these incredible ships. But one old woman's ideal vacation nearly went horribly wrong. Back to the narrative now. Ellie Smith was an elderly woman who most people would consider to be unremarkable. Her age was 76, but her life had not been an easy one. Ellie was raised in an extremely low-income yet deeply religious household. They all adhered as faithfully as possible to the teachings of the Bible and had a deep trust in God. In order to fit in with her family, Ellie joyfully followed her family's religious practices as a young child, even though she was unaware of the laws and restrictions that accompanied the Bible's teachings. But as Ellie grew older, she started to doubt the things her family and the Bible told her. She wanted to go out and have fun like her friends did when she was a young woman, since she had witnessed them doing so. Ellie met up with some of her pals one night after sneaking out of her house. They even sneaked a couple drinks with them at a nearby hangout. Ellie was enjoying her little moment of independence and was having a good time when she suddenly saw a pretty young man across the room who appeared to have seen her as well. Ellie turned her head as soon as she saw the kid looking at her, but a few seconds later he approached her to have a conversation. The youth identified himself as George, and soon after that, the two adolescents were having a lengthy talk. Ellie sneaked away again a couple more times after that night. But a few weeks into their encounter, the young woman's life completely collapsed when she found out she was pregnant. Ellie, barely 16, was at a loss for what to do. Since she understood that her family did not think that a girl should date a male till she was married, she was afraid that her life would end and how they would respond. After a few weeks, Ellie's tummy continued to swell. She was aware that she would have to disclose the incident to her family. Ellie's father was incensed after hearing the news and alerting her relatives, thinking she ought to be removed from the family since he had reared a bad kid. But Ellie's mother managed to persuade her husband to allow Ellie to stay. The only condition was that after the baby was born, she would have to place it for adoption. Ellie was horrified to hear this. She consented, though, as she had no notion what to do next. She reasoned that it was probably for the best, since I wouldn't know how to raise a child. After 9 months, Ellie's due day finally came around. A healthy baby boy was born to her, and he was soon taken to his eager family, who, upon his birth, had made the decision to adopt him. Ellie was devastated when her kid was removed from her and only had one chance to see him. As the years went by, Ellie made a name for herself. She was able to obtain employment as a teacher at a nearby school and possessed a modest house. Still, it was sufficient for her and her spouse alone. Unfortunately, adoption or surrogacy were too costly for Ellie and her husband, who were married but unable to conceive. The elder woman couldn't help but wonder what had become of the kid she had carried in her earlier years at this period. She couldn't locate any information on her son, though, because the adoption was closed. As the years went by, Ellie and her husband decided to save money for a very costly luxury trip as a way to make up for not being able to have children. The couple's financial situation was modest, but they pinched penny after penny and saved as much as they could until at last they had enough cash. Regretfully, Ellie's spouse suffered a fatal heart attack just months before of their scheduled vacation, and he sadly departed away. Ellie was so overcome with sadness. She couldn't believe her spouse was no longer with her since she had loved him with all of her heart. The 76-year-old, however, was adamant on living the remainder of her life to the fullest since she felt it was what her husband would want. The old woman took her ticket and left on her cruise when the time arrived. She would always remember the incident, though. Ellie couldn't help but notice all of the extraordinarily well-dressed people surrounding her as she stood in line to board the ship. She couldn't help but notice all of the glares they were giving her, though, on top of that. It appeared as though the elderly woman's appearance was the basis for everyone else's judgment. Ellie's outfit was obviously worn and torn, with the old lady even having to sew up a few small holes herself. Ellie had no intention of parting with that specific dress. Her husband had loved it, and she didn't think things that still had life in them should be thrown away. As soon as the old woman boarded the ship, things only got worse. The security officers regarded her with the same contempt as the other travelers. Ellie was even dragged out of the check-in queue by a security who wanted to make sure she had the right ticket because he couldn't believe someone who was obviously so poor could afford such an opulent vacation. Fortunately, Ellie's paperwork was all in order, and she was permitted to board the ship. But on the way to her cabin, the old lady was approached by a steward who informed her that the captain had asked to see her. Ellie was shocked and couldn't understand why the captain wanted to meet her. Because she wasn't as wealthy as everyone else, he wasn't surely throwing her off the cruise ship. With hesitation, Ellie followed the steward to the captain's location. She worried the whole time that she would not get to go on the vacation that she and her spouse had always wanted to do. Ellie was escorted by the steward to the dining room where the majority of the other guests had gathered. They all gave the elderly woman a visibly hateful and contemptuous look. They even started muttering that it was about time the old lady was thrown off the ship when they noticed that the captain was waiting for her. but the captain couldn't help but smile when he saw the old woman. Ellie was initially perplexed. Why was the captain staring at her with such warmth and candor? The old woman approached the captain when she was near enough and said something quietly. Her words, "I'm not sure what's going on here," were unclear. All the man did was give her a kind smile and say something that made Ellie start to cry. "It's been a long time, Mom." It out that her son Joshua was in fact the cruise ship's captain and had been looking for his biological mother ever since learning he had been adopted. He had been able to learn her name, but he had not been able to locate her residence to pay her a visit because she and her husband had moved about a lot. Joshua was eager to surprise his mother because he had noticed her name on the guest list. Ellie felt overpowered by the circumstances. Because the adoption agency wouldn't provide her with information about her son's location, she had always wanted to find him but had never been able to. After the mother and son embraced, the captain turned to face the bewildered onlookers. "This is my mother," he declared. "Due to events beyond her control, I have finally met her for the first time in 60 years. I'm overjoyed to have met her at last. Don't ever undervalue the people in your life, as you never know when you could run across them again." The audience as a whole cast shamed glances down. They didn't even know the old woman's tale, so how could they have judged her so harshly? Ellie, unaffected by the opinions of others, devoted the remainder of her trip to spending as much time as possible with Joshua in the hopes of developing a strong relationship. Ellie and Joshua continued to communicate even after the vacation ended, happy to be back together after all these years apart. What a charming tale. It simply goes to demonstrate that you should never make snap judgments about someone based only on their appearance, since you never know what kind of experiences they may have had. Treat each other with kindness. Please share your thoughts about the story in the comments section below. The young divers, Mike and Jeff, had decided to see a gigantic cruise ship that had crashed on the land 10 years earlier, so they started out early in the morning. Not that the ship seemed particularly sturdy, and who knew what they may have found inside. If something were to happen to one of them while they were out there, it may be pretty dangerous, and there was no way they could make it back to the shore in time. However, Jeff ignored her advice and started looking for a way into the structure. From the moment they boarded the cruise ship, they sensed the ominous atmosphere that surrounded them. The sound of the water slapping against the tank bottom and the cracking of the metal frame were the only sounds audible. The two of them said, "Wow, exactly same. I think we should head back," Mike said, but Jeff was already out of the room. They started off in the large, airy main hall, which included a massive staircase that led to the upper decks and high ceilings all around. They then continued on to the cabins. As Jeff and Mike strolled through the deserted corridors of the ship, they heard an odd noise. Mike was startled and asked Jeff whether he had heard it too, but Jeff shrugged and continued on. Jeff showed interest in venturing farther below deck to explore the ship's lowest levels after a short period. Their goal was at the top of a short stairway, but it was completely dark. The sound was far softer than a muffled scream, and it thoroughly terrified off Jeff and Mike. With fear in their eyes, they fixed one another with stares. They strolled for a short while before arriving at their destination. Knowing that there was no way for them to reach the bottom of the ship, they were perplexed as to why there was a dead end. In the corner, Mike saw a door. Jeff grabbed the doorknob and tugged as hard as he could to unlock the stuck door. He listened intently with his ear to the door. "There is no doubt that the sound is emanating from within this space," he said, moving to stand next to Mike and doing the same, straining his ear to the door. Suddenly, they heard something that almost made their hearts stop beating, which surprised them. A boat was drawing nearer to the ship, and they could hear the muffled sounds of men fighting with one another. It sounded as though they were boarding the cruise ship together. "Ship," Mike murmured, before adding, "I knew this was a bad idea." They understood how urgent their circumstances were. They raced back to the stairway, only to hear a set of rumbling footsteps from below, just as they were about to start climbing. They whirled around, retrieved their flashlights, and ducked behind the stairway so they wouldn't be seen. As the men moved down the metal ladder, they got closer and closer, and they held their breath in anticipation. The ship echoed with their heavy footsteps. 3 men descended the stairs and approached the locked door directly. When the men opened the door, Mike could see what was going on inside since they were being watched from where they were standing. Abruptly, the low cry grew considerably louder. "We have to get out of here as soon as possible," he said to himself. Those men not only outnumbered Mike and Jeff, but they were also significantly bigger and stronger than them. In addition, Mike noticed that one of them had a pistol, which added a great deal of difficulty to an already challenging position. After they agreed that it could take some time to contact the police, Mike plucked up the guts and agreed to accompany Jeff in peering behind the closed door to observe what the men were doing. They moved cautiously toward the exit, paying close attention to the men's talk as they did so. His heart felt like it was about to burst out of his chest, and he couldn't wait for the cops to arrive. Quietly, Jeff said, "All right, I'm getting ready." With a hasty retreat into the darkness, Jeff let Mike's eyelids open. After being left behind in the room, the man bolted out the door and made his way toward the stairs. Mike and Jeff could only hear the muted sounds of footsteps as they hurried for the chamber as soon as they could emerge from the shadows. Mike was going to follow Jeff when he heard the other men emerge from the basement. Jeff had pulled open the massive door and gone into the building. Mike became frozen, unable to think of anything to do. Jeff could see that the other man and the woman were fighting physically, and he could hear a woman sobbing, but it sounded like she had something trapped in her mouth. Jeff and Mike made a beeline for the woman. She was restrained, duct tape covering her lips, and forced to bind herself to a chair. Mike had unlocked her hands and Jeff had loosened her legs. Even though they were far away, they could still hear the police sirens. The woman was too fragile to stand on her own, so they helped her. The cops were shocked by the scenario they had been called to when they did eventually arrive. They took quick turns barging into the building and taking the 2 guys into custody. The woman was successfully taken to a secure area, but they needed Mike and Jeff to go with them to the police station. At the police station, Jeff and Mike were questioned and asked to provide a detailed description of everything that had happened. They were afraid they would be arrested by the authorities for being on the ship when they weren't permitted to be there in the first place. But the cops were relieved when the response was quite different from what they had expected. Because of the praise they received for their bravery, Jeff and Mike were released from custody. It became out later that the woman they had saved was everything but ordinary. She was the governor's daughter and had spent the last few days in captivity. By now, the person had already asked for money and then abruptly stopped communicating. The woman is probably not going to survive the night. The governor praised the young men and handed them each a sizable reward for their valiant efforts in saving his daughter because of Jeff and Mike's fast thinking. Both Jeff and Mike were still in disbelief at what had transpired. It was difficult for them to believe that this was truly happening to them. Please remember to subscribe to our channel, give us a thumbs up, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our videos. If you enjoyed the tale, the next video that plays on your screen will probably move you too.